The CX-50 is the perfect example of the conflicting priorities at Mazda right now. They're pulled in a bunch of different directions. Clearly, they want to be known as a style-forward brand, and they've certainly achieved that with the CX-50. But they also want to be known as a low-price brand. The base price of the CX-50 is thousands of dollars less than the competition, most notably the Honda and Toyota competition, and that applies to a lot of their lineup as well. And yet, simultaneously, they want to be known as a high-value brand and as a premium alternative to those other brands like Toyota and Honda. Can all of those things coexist, or is Mazda simply trying to juggle too many balls? Let's find out with the CX-50. Probably the only thing more difficult than defining premium is defining luxury. Is this a premium vehicle? I will let you come to your own conclusions and let me know in the comment section. But it is worth noting that Buick is also trying to go in this exact same direction. This conflicted mission of having relatively low prices while also saying they want to be a premium brand. On the other hand, Mazda's doing a better job of it when it comes to style. I love the look of the CX-50. I know that some folks think that this particular style is a little bit old hat, that it's been around a bit too long. I still think it works. I still think it's very attractive. And I like how they've evolved the design over time. So the grille no longer wraps completely around. It's actually cut through with these headlights. And then we have sort of angel eye BMW style headlights in there. I think it's all a really solid look, especially when you consider the price tag. This starts at $27,550. Again, thousands of dollars less than a RAV4 or CR-V, and all-wheel drive is standard on every model. At this point, some of you are probably thinking, hang on, isn't the CX-5 Mazda's RAV4 competitor? And the answer is yes, but also the CX-50. Here's what's going on. The CX-5 is far and away Mazda's best seller, and they couldn't really just kill it off in favor of an all-new model with an all-new name, at least not quite right away. So although we don't have confirmation from Mazda on this yet, the CX-5 is probably not going to get a refresh or a redesign. Instead, like we saw in CX-3 to CX-30, this is going to effectively replace the CX-5 over time. It's a different format of vehicle, of course, because it is a little bit longer in body. This is actually one of the longest entries in the segment at 185.8 inches long, and a slightly lower roofline design than we see in the CX-5, giving it a bit more of a station wagon, maybe Subaru Outback-y kind of vibe. Definitely also get those sorts of vibes with the amount of body cladding we find all the way around. Now, full disclosure, this is not a base CX-50, although from the outside, you could be forgiven for confusing them because there isn't a lot of external differentiation. They all have dual exhaust tips, although there are subtle changes to the back end and the front end. We have full LED taillights back here with LED turn signals, which is a nice touch, and they do have this kind of cool fade on and off thing going on there. Mazda has some really great light designs, and actually the CX-50 I think has simply the best headlights in this segment, especially if you're interested in bright, swiveling headlights that really steer aggressively in the corners. This is far and away better than what we find in the Honda and Toyota, although obviously not all those features will be found in the base version. As we'll talk about when we get inside, longer does not always mean roomier. Mazda gives us a really long hood profile, but that means that versus the entire length of the vehicle, we have a slightly smaller interior section. You'll notice that some of this front end is occupied by crash structures, cooling for the intercooler for the turbo, etc., but they also end up placing the engine a little bit further forward than you might suspect because of some of the exhaust routing going on behind there. It gives it more of a BMW style hood, even though drivetrain-wise, this is more closely related to a RAV4 or CR-V. Engine-wise, there are two different 2.5-liter four-cylinders under the hood. The base model comes with 187 horsepower, 186 pound-feet of torque. The turbo model bumps that all the way up to 256 horsepower, 320 pound-feet of torque, and those numbers will derate a little bit if you don't give it premium gas. However, it will run on regular unleaded if you'd rather feed it that. Both engines are mated to a standard 6-speed automatic transmission, so if you don't like CVTs, there isn't one under this hood. Unfortunately, also not under this hood would be an 8, 9, or 10-speed automatic transmission, and that's part of why fuel economy numbers are a little bit lower than some of the competition. Also, performance numbers are not quite as high as you might think, given the amount of power, because we just don't have quite as advantageous of a gear ratio for every situation. Mazda, of course, disputes that. They claim the 6-speed automatic is perfection. But in the CX-90, they decided to give us an 8-speed automatic, so that should tell you where things are going. Fuel economy will range between 25 and 27 miles per gallon because all-wheel drive is standard. Not found under this hood yet, but theoretically coming at some point is a hybrid system. Mazda talked about that when the CX-50 launched, but we don't have any details on that just yet, aside from the fact that it's probably going to be a joint venture Mazda-Toyota hybrid system, so fairly likely pretty close to what we find in a RAV4 hybrid. I would be surprised if that model did not give us similarly high fuel economy whenever it finally arrives. Front seat comfort is pretty similar to the rest of the Mazda lineup. I found the general seat design pretty comfortable, but it's not as adjustable as you might think for a brand that wants to be premium. No four-way lumbar support for the driver. The passenger seat on this top-end trim does not adjust for seat bottom tilt, and there's no adjustable lumbar support there either. We do, however, have a tilt telescopic steering column with a large range of motion and a seating position that I definitely find comfortable. The interesting thing about the CX-50 is that Mazda seems to have wanted this vehicle to feel a bit more like a Subaru Outback in some ways, so the driving position is a little bit more relaxed, a little bit more sedan-like naturally in here. You, of course, could put this seat very upright. The tricky part with that, of course, is that the roofline is a little bit lower than some of the competition. So if I start to get the seat a little bit too high to give me more of an SUV-like seating position, then I simply run out of headroom. Both front and rear headroom is a little bit below average, as is combined legroom. 81.5 inches is a healthy figure, but it is a little bit lower than some of the leaders in this segment, and remember, this is longer than most of them. Still, at 6 feet tall, I can sit comfortably behind myself with about 2 inches of legroom left. If you wanted to put a rear-facing child seat in here, that could be a little bit trickier than some. However, you probably will have an easier job of that in something like the Tucson or the Sportage. And you will notice the difference if I try and go over here with this front seat all the way back in its tracks. My knees just sort of go into this little dished out section of the seat. They're definitely a little bit tight there, and the footwell is also a little on the tight side. Rear passengers get USB charge ports, heated rear seats, air vents right there in the center console. There's a reasonable hump in the middle, but if I climb over that, you can see that we get 60/40 folding rear seat backs, no ski pass-through or anything like that, but we do have a softly padded center armrest and a shoulder belt for the center seat position that comes out of the seat itself, certainly making that part easier for child seat installation. Behind the available power hatch, we find 31.4 cubic feet of cargo space. That's a function of the sloping rear hatch and also the general profile of the CX-50, which again is a little bit more wagon-like than boxy crossover with a slightly lower roofline. If you want to put bikes or kayaks or things like that on top of your vehicle, that is going to make this more cargo practical, however. So you'll really notice that that roof load height is a little bit lower than a RAV4. The downside is that the cargo area is decently smaller than a RAV4 or some of the larger cargo areas in this segment. Going in for a closer look, we have handles to release the rear seat backs from back here. That's a nice touch, so you can do it from back here or from the passenger area. And then under the load floor, we have a temporary spare tire. It does not appear that there would be enough room in here for a full-size spare tire, even if you opted for the model with the 225 width tires, but you can use some of this extra space here for storage. Right there in the middle of the spare, we find the optional Bose subwoofer. While we're talking about tires, let's talk about these, because these are unusual for Mazda, at least historically unusual. For quite some time now, Mazda has been putting fairly skinny tires on all of their vehicles. That's obviously to help improve fuel economy. But things have gone in a different direction for top-end trim CX-50s and of course the new CX-90, which has some of the widest tires in its segment. At 245, these are now some of the widest tires in this segment, but you will only find them on the top 2 trims. If you get the Meridian trim, you get an entirely different tire. It's more off-road focused. It's the all-terrain tire that is standard from the factory. As we look around the interior, keep in mind this is the top-end trim. That center console has a sunglass holder, and then we have extending sun visors for the driver and front passenger. The CX-50 is Mazda's first panoramic sunroof. You can see it's not the largest in the segment, but it does go back there to just about the rear passenger's laps. I also apologize for this interior being very, very, very dark. It's a charcoal interior, so some of the detail may get a little bit lost. We have height adjustable shoulder belts for the driver and front passenger. The front seat design is very similar to the Mazda 3 and the Mazda CX-30 as well. Mazda's given the upholstery a number of nice touches, like the eccentric stitching in the middle and the contrasting piping on the outside. The seat back and seat bottom cushion are perforated because these seats are both heated and ventilated. You'll notice that the bolstering is not terribly aggressive for the seat back or seat bottom cushion, so larger folks shouldn't have any problem in here. As part of Mazda's premium mission, they've given us a bit more soft touch material on the front doors than you'll find in most of the competition. We find that same eccentric stitching going on right there in the middle of that soft touch panel, and that really is a very soft, squishy insert right there in the middle of the door. We also have a soft touch component below that, and then a soft, squishy armrest, hard plastics down there at the bottom of the door. The same sort of stitching goes on the dashboard, and again, the same sort of really soft touch material. You can see how much that deflects as I press on it. But what's unusual about the dashboard design, I think, is the way this air vent just kind of hangs out right here in the middle. Let me know what you think about that. It's a little bit difficult to see in the lighting in this cabin, but if I brighten things up, you can see there's a pretty strong bar that runs right there across the dashboard, and then we have this little cut in because that air vent is right there. Also large air vents on either side of that for the driver and the front passenger. You can see how that's arranged right there. Soft touch upper section of the dashboard, hard plastics lower, and then a decently sized slot style glove compartment. You can just barely fit some of those larger tablet computers inside there. Moving over to the middle of the dashboard, we find one of the things that I am a little bit bummed about still. This is a touchscreen, but not the way you think. So you can touch using Apple CarPlay or Android Auto, but if I go back to the native Mazda interface, all of a sudden the touchscreen does nothing. I do think that's a bit of a bummer. The other thing to know is that the touchscreen is still high and far away from the driver and front passenger, really making using that touchscreen a little bit on the awkward side. Now, that's logical, of course, because Mazda would really like you to use their controller knob. They say that takes less time with your eyes off the road, but honestly, I think the touchscreen is just easier to use and definitely my preference. Down here in the middle of the dashboard, we find the controls for the dual zone automatic climate control toggles, very similar to what we find in the Mazda 3. Well, I should say almost toggles, because these look like them, but you actually just press the buttons right there on the top. Below that, we have the controls for the heated and ventilated seats, engine start, stop button. Down here, we have a place where you can put your smartphone, two definitely large cup holders right in front of the shifter. It's not my favorite spot, but they are pretty big. Speaking of shifters, it has a manual mode over there towards the driver's side. You then toggle it up and down. Over here, we have the MI drive selection, so you can choose between sport, normal, and off-road modes. The controller for that infotainment system, auto brake hold right over here, electric parking brake. If you're wondering where the wireless charge mat is, it's right there. That actually is pretty convenient because you can just have your phone hang out in that area, and it did work through thicker cases. We then have a split fold center armrest, USB ports in there. It's not overly deep, so you couldn't put larger items inside there for storage. Versus some of Mazda's product line, the CX-50 has kind of a narrower center console, so footroom is absolutely not a problem. If we go over to the driver's side of the dashboard, you'll notice we have a full color heads-up display actually projected on the windshield. That's a really nice touch. But Mazda giveth and then Mazda doesn't giveth, because here we find not a full LCD like you find in some of the competition, but a small LCD in the middle, flanked by physical gauges on the outside. Now, I do like the look. It is definitely nice and crisp. It's just not as snazzy as the full LCD that you will find in something like the RAV4 now. Mazda still gives us a fantastic steering wheel. It is not overly thickly rimmed, so if you're not a fan of big, thick steering wheels, this is going to be a good wheel for you, but it does have a nice ergonomic feel to it. Sport grips up top, paddle shifters on the back there. You'll find toggles for the volume and track forward, backward on the steering wheel on this side, along with the voice command button, phone button, info button. And then over here on this side, it's a little bit difficult to see in the light, but we then have steering assist, cruise control, adaptive cruise control, the distance, and then the speed settings right there. Now let's get the CX-50 out on the road. Clearly this is going to be the most fun version because this is the turbo with the wider tires. 0 to 60 happened in 5.9 seconds. That is definitely a solid score for this segment and has a really great feel to it. Now before a lot of you ask, yes, that was on regular unleaded. And was there a difference for regular and premium? In our testing, no. But keep in mind the temperature when we were testing was 66 degrees both days. The vehicle arrived with premium, we did our 0 to 60 runs, we then consumed the entire tank of gas. It was a lot of fun, put regular unleaded in it, got exactly the same 0 to 60 time after we let it consume a few gallons. That's logical because it's not an on-off switch. It's not like it has a octane detector in there and ooh, we put regular, suddenly we're gonna get 7 seconds 0 to 60. That's not how it works. What's going on is it just means that the engine can adapt to accidental pre-ignition of the gasoline. So if you're driving this on regular unleaded in Death Valley at 120 degrees, yes, you're going to see a reduced power output, and yes, that output would be less if you had premium in your gas tank, but really it's a sliding scale. It's not an on-off switch. Now, when it came to 0 to 60 times, if you don't get the turbocharged engine, you'll end up at around 8.6 seconds. So think Nissan Versa, some of the slower entries in the segment as far as 0 to 60 time. And that all has to do with this 6-speed automatic transmission. And it's something you'll certainly notice. If, for instance, I come to a stop here again and I floor it, it takes a while till we actually get up to a speed where the engine can really give us all that horsepower and all that torque. The peak, of course, of the torque and horsepower curve is not identical, but where they meet, you're getting the strongest acceleration. And that's going to be a relatively smaller window with this transmission because it shifts and then you're kind of out of the power band. Now, the 6-speed transmission does have a nice feel to it, and there are a lot less gears to hunt through and choose from, but it probably still would be faster if it had an 8-speed auto, and that's exactly why we see one on the new CX-90. When it came to 60 to 0 stopping distances, this did pretty well. 115 feet. That is definitely shorter than the last CX-50 I tested with these narrower tires on it at 122 feet. So these 245 with tires, definitely an asset. They also really improve handling. And the CX-50 has a fantastic feel to it. Really, much like the CX-30, this is a lot of fun to drive hard. You can drive this at 9/10 relatively easily. It's easy to find the limits in this vehicle. It's just an absolute hoot and a half to drive when the road starts winding like this. The trouble is, this is one of the very few new vehicles over about $25,000 or so that does not have at least optional an independent suspension in the back. No independent suspension in the CX-50 at all, much like the Mazda 3 and the Mazda CX-30. And you will notice that out on roads like this. If you're in tight corners like this and the pavement is less than perfect, you'll notice that the rear end will kind of skitter around those obstacles in a less refined manner versus something like a CR-V or a RAV4. This is a tricky game of nuance. The rear suspension design is clearly not as elegant as the one that we find in the Toyota and the Honda. And again, you will notice that out on roads like this. But that does not make the CX-50 less fun than the Honda or the Toyota. In fact, this is certainly more fun. I think it handles better in the way that you would normally associate good handling, the way that it works with the driver, the way you can tell what the vehicle is doing, the absolute levels of grip, just everything put together. This has a really solid, really great feel to it. But it does leave the window open to wondering what it could be like if it had an independent rear suspension. If Mazda had gone that next level, spent a little bit more money back there and given us a really fantastic rear suspension design. Clearly there are pros and cons to everything, and Mazda was focused on lower cost, giving us more cargo room in the back, things like that. That's probably what was going on. But I still would love to see what a CX-50 would be like with an independent rear. Now remember, Mazda wants to be seen as the premium alternative to the competition, and they're trying to do that with arguably a less premium suspension in the back. When it comes to the ride score, I give the CX-50 a B, whether we're on-road or off-road. You'll certainly notice those small imperfections coming through into the cabin. Mazda did a good job of that, but this is certainly skewed towards the sportier side of things, which is another interesting twist since Mazda would also like you to see them as an off-road brand, and that's why we have the new Meridian trim of the CX-50. Also, quite a lot of ground clearance and standard all-wheel drive. So that's just yet another direction that Mazda's pulling themselves in. The lack of an independent rear suspension is also noticeable out on a rougher road surface like the gravel road that we're on here. Again, Mazda's done a really good job with this suspension, but for a brand that wants to be seen as not only sporty but also premium, it still strikes me as kind of an odd choice. Because if you start pushing this a little bit harder out on a gravel road surface like this, you'll notice that the rear suspension is just not as well sorted as some of the competition. And some of the competition that really didn't have great suspension tunes 20 years ago or so now really have dialed things in, most notably something like the Sportage and the Tucson. Not directly part of the way the CX-50 drives, but it is worth noting that if you like a big opening for your sunroof, there's a big compromise. This only opens about 9 inches or so up here. It's a little bit difficult to see, but the opening goes to right about there on my head. There's actually quite a lot of that first pane left. It just doesn't fold over quite that way. A little bit disappointed that it doesn't open further. This actually is one of the smaller opening sunroofs that I've seen lately. In my cabin noise testing at 50 miles an hour, I measured 71 decibels in here, putting this on the quieter side of the mainstream segment. When it comes to fuel economy though, this is on the thirstier side of things. Theoretically, the EPA average for this model should be around 25 miles per gallon. I've been averaging 21.5 miles per gallon over a week of mixed driving, and even driving it relatively nicely, we ended up at around 23.5. I think that simply has to do with the 6-speed automatic transmission, the relatively wide tires, and maybe the fun mission of the CX-50 as well. The wider tires obviously have an effect on fuel economy, but likely the fact that this doesn't have some sort of ultra high efficiency, high gear ratio for highway driving, that likely also has an impact. If you're trying to decide between the 2023 CX-50 and a 2024 CX-50, you should know that there's just one change that will affect the way that it drives, and one change that will affect your pocketbook. The base price went up considerably because the base trim has actually been deleted for 2024. So things start one step higher. And of course, that one step higher got a bit more expensive. Now, as to the suspension change, they swapped in some new dampers. It seems that a lot of folks thought that the CX-50 was just a little bit too firm. Again, that adds to the sporty feel, but if you want to take it further off the beaten path, you might want a slightly softer suspension. So that's exactly what they've done for 2024. They've swapped in some different dampers. They say it's going to calm down the ride just a little bit. Now, don't expect a night and day change. Expect it to just be a little bit softer, a little bit better able to soak up some of those bumps. Hopefully I will be able to get my hands on the 2024 CX-50 soon, and hopefully I will try and drive it back to back with the 2023 model year vehicle. I suspect if you don't drive them back to back, you're probably not going to notice too much of a difference. Now, again, the pricing is the bigger change, so let's talk about pricing first and how it fits in the landscape. For 2024, we don't actually know too many of the competition's base prices yet, so expect these 2023 model year vehicles to go up maybe $300 to $400 depending on exactly what the inflation landscape looks like when those prices are announced. So currently, the 2024 CX-50 now is between the RAV4 and CR-V all-wheel drive models in terms of its base price. It's no longer the discount option in this segment, and it is a little bit more expensive than the CX-5 at $31,675. And it goes a bit higher as well, up to about $45,300 or so. That's not as high as a RAV4, however, even in 2023 dollars, because of course we have the RAV4 Prime. Now, $51,000 some odd and change is still a lot to pay for a RAV4, but you do get the plug-in hybrid ability. You also get 300 horsepower. It's going to be a little bit faster than the CX-50, but the difference is not enormous, and the CX-50 is still going to be more engaging with its traditional mechanical all-wheel drive system. Now, the realigned pricing in the CX-50 perhaps makes it a little bit more conflicted than before because it's not trying to also be one of the bargain entries in this segment. But in a way, it also makes me a little bit sadder about the lack of fully independent suspension in the rear. When it comes to the final scores, the CX-50 is very easy to live with. It's attractive inside and out, it's an absolute hoot to drive if you get the optional turbocharged engine, and the headlights are fantastic. These are all certainly key things for owning a vehicle long term that I would look for. On the other hand, the infotainment system can be a bit infuriating. If you're not a fan of the controller knob, you're not going to like the system in the CX-50. You should spend a reasonable amount of time looking at that system, trying it, seeing if it's something that you can handle. I have a reasonable number of emails from shoppers that have gone out recently and bought recent Mazda products with the controller knob, and they haven't been a big fan of it. Remember that the touchscreen functionality is Apple CarPlay and Android Auto only, essentially. There are some aftermarket tweaks that you can do to enable that functionality while you're driving, but the screen position really isn't in a place where that makes an awful lot of sense. So you just have to be okay with the rotary controller, and some folks certainly love it. So if you're on that side, it's going to be fantastic, not a problem. If you're not a fan of knob controllers, you probably want to skip this and go somewhere else. Also on the downside, we have the fuel economy. It is middling in most models. It's not bad, but it's not fantastic either. The turbocharged engine obviously gets lower fuel economy than the rest, but I don't think that's a particular problem. I actually have a bit more of a problem with the fuel economy in the regular version because by the time you've bought the turbo, you're probably after the fun factor and you're willing to pay a bit more on the fuel economy front. It's worth noting that the most popular entry in this segment at the moment is the Toyota RAV4, and Toyota is selling about 40% of their volume as the 40 mile per gallon hybrid model. It's easy to see why. 40 miles per gallon is fantastic, and that will have a massive impact on your pocketbook. It's also worth noting that the RAV4 hybrid is right around the same price as the base versions of the Mazda CX-50 all-wheel drive. It's not that big of a difference price-wise to get that hybrid system, which is why I really have to ask, where is the hybrid in the CX-50 that Mazda has promised? They've promised a hybrid CX-50 and they promised a plug-in hybrid MX-30, and neither one has shown up yet. We know that the MX-30 is just not happening now, but they haven't said anything about the regular hybrid CX-50. Hopefully it's coming soon. Then last we have sort of the controversial entry on this pros and cons chart. It's the engine, the steering, the tires, and the nature of the vehicle writing checks that the rear suspension can't quite cash. This is last on my list actually for two reasons, because it's the one that bugged me perhaps the most while driving it, but it's also the one that's probably going to be the least important for a lot of shoppers considering the CX-50, and I have to temper this with that reality. If you are daily driving your vehicle, you maybe have a little bit of fun out on your favorite winding mountain road, but you don't push your car too hard, and you're not getting the turbo model, then it's probably not a big deal. Let's be honest. Most folks out there that are CR-V, RAV4, or CX-50 shopping are not autocrossing on the weekend or really driving their car that hard. But if you want the most fun entry in this segment, which is theoretically what the CX-50 is all about, and you want the most premium entry in this segment, which is theoretically what Mazda is all about these days, and you want the prettiest option in the segment, the most powerful option in the segment, all of that, that is the CX-50. But then it's all combined with the rear suspension that just is not as well sorted as some of the competitions. The fun-to-drive nature is still certainly there. We have the relatively wide tires. We have the somewhat firm suspension, which again has been tweaked for 2024, but all of that together just makes you want to drive the CX-50 harder, and then we have that rear suspension that can't quite keep up. Again, it's not a big deal. It's not like you drive this back-to-back with your RAV4 and you're going to notice it every time, because the RAV4 just can't do what the CX-50 can do. It's simply that Mazda wants to push their lineup a little bit further forward, and we just don't have what I was expecting in the CX-50 in the segment for its price tag. Remember, it does go up higher than a number of those other options without a hybrid and without a plug-in hybrid in the lineup. Certainly keep that part in mind. And let me know what you think about that down there in the comment section below. Does it bother you that Mazda has gone in this particular direction? Obviously, it's a cost-saving measure because it shares some design elements with the CX-30 and the Mazda 3 sedan and the Mazda 3 hatch. But I am a little bit disappointed that they, in some ways, went backwards as far as suspension technology in the rear. And it's worth noting this is absolutely not what we find in their more expensive products. So CX-90, the new CX-70, etc., they're not going to get this style of rear suspension. So let me know what you think about all that. And let me know, is this a bit of a barrier for you to consider the CX-50 against a Lexus NX or a Buick Envision or something along those lines? I don't toss those names around lightly because I would honestly cross-shop the CX-50 with a Lexus NX in its top-end trim. I think it's actually more fun than the Lexus, and I think it's also a little bit better looking than the NX as well. I would also cross-shop this against the Buick. It's certainly more fun to drive than the Buick. But it's not more fun to drive than the fun-to-drive entries in that segment. It's not going to be more fun to drive than the BMW, than the Audi, than the Mercedes, than the Volvo, etc. It is going to be closer to the Acura RDX, but the RDX is still more fun to drive than the CX-50. And this has a price tag that is really pushing up against those premium entries. Anyway, let me know what you think about all that. Hit the subscribe button if you haven't already done so. Check out the related content, especially the CX-30 video, and I'll see all of you next week.